Trump versus Maduro. The seizure of a Venezuelan oil tanker didn't dominate headlines for long, but the implications behind it run far deeper than most people realized. At first glance, the story seems simple. A ship, long suspected of helping Venezuela bypass U.S. sanctions, is finally off story, except it isn't. Because once you step back and look at how this tanker operated, who it was connected to, and why it took years for action to happen, a much more complex picture begins to emerge. This isn't just a story about a ship, it's about how modern sanctions are enforced, how shadow oil networks operate in plain sight, and how geopolitical pressure quietly reshapes global trade without most people noticing. And the most interesting part isn't what happened. It's what had already been happening for years. By the time U.S. authorities moved to seize the tanker, it was no secret that Venezuela had been struggling under heavy sanctions. After years of political tension, accusations of democratic backsliding, and disputed elections, the United States imposed restrictions aimed at cutting off the Maduro government from critical sources of revenue, especially oil. For Venezuela, oil isn't just an industry, it's the backbone of the economy. When legal export channels tightened, alternatives quickly emerged. Not new oil fields, not new customers, just new routes, new paperwork, new flags, new layers of distance between the oil and its origin. That's where tankers like this come in. Oil doesn't disappear when sanctions are imposed. It moves differently. Tankers change names. They switch ownership on paper. They turn off tracking systems. They transfer cargo at sea. This isn't a theory. It's a documented pattern in sanction-heavy environments from Iran to North Korea to Venezuela. Analysts and maritime trackers have been observing these behaviors for years. The ship in question had reportedly been flagged repeatedly for suspicious movements consistent with sanction evasion, but suspicion alone isn't action. And that delay is part of what makes this story so revealing. For years, this tanker operated in a gray zone. It wasn't hidden in the dark. It wasn't invisible. It moved through international waters, ports, and logistical chains known to global regulators. And yet, it continued operating. That's not because no one noticed, but because enforcement is far more complicated than it looks from the outside. Sanctions aren't enforced by a single switch. They rely on evidence, jurisdiction, international cooperation, and timing. And during that time, money keeps flowing. Cargo keeps moving. And the system quietly adapts. This is where the story shifts. Because the seizure didn't happen randomly. It happened during a broader phase of political signaling between Washington and Korea. Under the Trump administration, sanctions on Venezuela became more aggressive, more visible, and more explicit. The goal wasn't subtle pressure. It was economic isolation. In that context, seizing a tanker sends a message that's louder than any press release. It says, we're not just watching, we're acting. And that message isn't aimed only at Venezuela. It's aimed at ship owners, insurers, intermediaries, and buyers who operate in this shadow space. But here is the question most coverage didn't linger on. If this tanker had been suspected for so long, why act now? And what changed operationally or politically to make enforcement suddenly possible? The answer isn't a single decision. It's the accumulation of documentation, tracking data, financial records, and international alignment. Sanction enforcement often works slowly, then all at once. For years, evidence builds quietly. Then one day, a ship is seized. And it looks sudden, even though it wasn't. That's the part most people miss. The seizure wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of a long monitoring process. Analysts had been watching the tanker's routes. Regulators had been mapping corporate structures. Financial authorities had been tracing payment mechanisms. None of that is dramatic. None of that trends on social media. But it's the machinery that makes a high-profile move legally possible. And when that machinery finally turns, the result looks decisive. What makes this case particularly interesting is how it highlights the limits of sanctions. Despite years of pressure, Venezuela continued moving oil. Buyers continued finding ways to purchase it indirectly. The global demand for energy doesn't stop Because politics shift, and shadow networks exist precisely to exploit that demand. The tanker wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom. One asset in a much larger system designed to function quietly between the lines of international law. And that brings up another uncomfortable reality. For every tanker seized, others continue operating. The global shipping industry is vast. Monitoring it perfectly is impossible. Enforcement actions are selective by necessity. Authorities choose moments where evidence is strong, political alignment exists, and strategic impact is maximized. That doesn't mean other ships are ignored. It means enforcement is asymmetric, and that asymmetry is part of how the system survives. The media tends to frame these events as political wins or losses. Trump versus Maduro, U.S. power versus a sanctioned regime. But the deeper story is less about personalities and more about systems. How energy flows when official channels close, how markets respond to restriction, how legality and illegality blur when incentives align, and how modern economic warfare rarely looks like confrontation. It looks like logistics. There's also a financial dimension that rarely gets attention. Tankers involved in sanction evasion often rely on complex insurance arrangements, shell companies, and intermediaries willing to accept higher risk for higher return. Every successful shipment reinforces the belief that the system works. That enforcement can be avoided. That consequences are unlikely, until suddenly they aren't. And when enforcement does happen, it's not just the ship that's affected, it's the network around it. Insurers pull back. Banks freeze funds. Partners disappear. The chilling effect spreads far beyond the single seizure. This is why the seizure mattered. Not because it stopped Venezuela's oil exports overnight. It didn't. But because it reminded participants in these networks that invisibility is temporary. That patterns can be that gray zones don't stay gray forever. And that geopolitical pressure, when sustained long enough, eventually crystallizes into action. Yet even with all that, unanswered questions remain. How many similar operations are still active? How many intermediaries knowingly participate versus looking the other way? How do enforcement priorities shift between administrations? And how much of the global economy quietly operates on the assumption that rules can be bent as long as enforcement lags behind behavior? None of those questions accuse anyone of hidden conspiracies. They're structural questions the kind economists, regulators, and security analysts ask constantly. And they matter because this isn't limited to Venezuela. The same mechanisms apply anywhere sanctions exist, anywhere political pressure meets economic necessity, anywhere global trade collides with national policy. In the end, the tanker seizure wasn't about one ship, one country, or one administration. It was a glimpse into how modern economic pressure really works. Slow, technical, often invisible, and occasionally very public. And while headlines moved on quickly, the underlying systems didn't disappear. They adjusted. They always do. Which is why this story doesn't really end with a seizure. It pauses. Because as long as demand exists, and as long as sanctions reshape rather than remove incentives, shadow networks will continue evolving. The names will change. The routes will shift. The ships will look ordinary. And unless you're paying attention, you might never notice them at all. And once you start seeing how this works in energy, you begin to recognize the same patterns everywhere else. Finance, trade, technology, even everyday consumer markets. Systems adapting quietly around rules designed to control them. Not through chaos, through structure, through patience, and through the spaces most people don't think to look.